For 18 years, my father convinced everyone I was just average. He opened the Brentwood front door that quiet morning wearing the smug smile of a man expecting the world to finally crown his golden son, Grant. But the well-dressed woman on our porch, a senior reporter for Fortune magazine, did not ask for the heir apparent. She held a thick file and asked to see the daughter my father had spent his entire life overlooking. I am Riley Hughes. It was exactly 7:30 in the morning on a crisp Tuesday in Brentwood, Tennessee. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of wealthy, insulated silence that cost millions of dollars to maintain. I was standing perfectly still in the shadows of the second-floor landing of my family home, my travel bag slung over my shoulder, ready to quietly slip out and catch my flight back to Charlotte. But my departure was halted by the scene unfolding in the grand foyer directly below me. My father, Dean Hughes, stood before the hallway mirror, adjusting a perfectly knotted silk tie. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and roasted coffee. In 30 minutes, he was scheduled to attend a power breakfast with the local Businessmen's Association at the country club. I knew exactly what his agenda was because he had been practicing his talking points all weekend. He was preparing to stand before his peers and loudly declare that his golden son, my older brother Grant, was formally stepping up as executive vice president. My father was ready to boast that under Grant's brilliant leadership, Hughes Ridge Supply would reach heights no one in the county had ever seen. Then, the doorbell rang. My father checked his gold watch, frowned slightly at the unexpected interruption, and pulled open the heavy oak door. Standing on our pristine front porch was a woman who clearly did not belong to our sleepy suburban bubble. She wore a sharp, dark gray tailored suit that spoke of coastal cities and high-stakes boardrooms. In one hand, she held a thick leather portfolio, and in the other, a silver digital voice recorder. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice crisp and professional. "My name is Nora Bell. I am a senior editor and investigative reporter for Fortune magazine." From my vantage point on the stairs, I watched my father's entire physical posture transform. The slight annoyance vanished, instantly replaced by the glowing, puffed-chest arrogance of a man who believed the universe had finally arrived at his doorstep to validate his masterpiece. He smiled, a wide, predatory grin that he usually reserved for banking executives. In his mind, there was only one possible reason a national business publication would send a senior reporter to his home. They had come for Grant. "Fortune magazine," my father repeated, his voice booming with forced humility. "Well, I cannot say I am entirely surprised. Please, come in. I assume you caught wind of our upcoming regional expansion. Or perhaps the aggressive supply chain integration my son is spearheading." Nora stepped over the threshold, but did not put away her voice recorder. "Mr. Hughes, I am here regarding—" "You are here for the heir apparent," my father interrupted smoothly, completely consumed by his own narrative. "Let me save you some time. Miss Bell, Grant is not just taking over a 40-year-old family legacy, he is reinventing it. The boy has an absolute gift. His networking capabilities are unmatched. His vision is completely limitless. Last quarter alone, his client acquisition strategy bumped our projections up by 15%. He knows how to shake the right hands, wear the right suits, and close the doors that others cannot even open. He is the future of the building materials industry in this state. I would be more than happy to give you a full sit-down interview about how I molded him for this exact moment." I leaned against the mahogany banister, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I watched him sell the illusion. He poured out every ounce of his pride, painting a picture of a titan of industry. Nora Bell did not cut him off. She simply stood there in the foyer, allowing my father to dig his own grave with his arrogance. She listened as he spent 5 full minutes explaining why men like him and his son were the rightful rulers of the American economy. She absorbed his absolute certainty, her face completely impassive. When he finally paused to take a breath, looking at her with a self-satisfied smirk, Nora adjusted her glasses. "That is a fascinating succession plan, Mr. Hughes," Nora said gently, her tone terrifyingly calm. "However, I am not here to interview Grant Hughes. I am here to meet Riley Hughes, the founder and chief executive officer of Blue Forge Systems." The silence that slammed into the foyer was absolute. It was the heaviest, most suffocating sound I had ever heard in that house. My father blinked. Once, twice. Then, a short, condescending laugh erupted from his chest. He shook his head, waving his hand as if swatting away a ridiculous insect. "Riley?" he scoffed. "My daughter Riley. Miss Bell, someone at your research desk has made a rather embarrassing mistake. My daughter does not run a tech company. She is an operations coordinator. She does spreadsheets in a back office. Riley is just an average girl. She lacks the killer instinct for leadership, and she certainly does not have the capacity to build anything worthy of Fortune magazine. You have the wrong address." He was so deeply entrenched in the lie he had built. For 18 years, he had framed me as the mediocre backup plan, the unremarkable daughter who could never match the blazing sun of his son. He was not going to let reality shatter his perfect worldview. Nora did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She calmly unzipped her leather portfolio and extracted a single, heavily stamped sheet of paper. She held it out to him. "These are the original articles of incorporation for Blue Forge Systems, filed 5 years ago," Nora explained, her voice echoing coldly against the marble floors. "You will notice that the registered legal address for the corporation is this exact property in Brentwood. You will also notice that the sole founding member, holding 100% of the initial equity, is Riley Hughes." My father took the paper. I watched from the shadows as his eyes darted across the page. I saw the exact moment his brain registered my signature at the bottom of the document. The color began to drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands, usually so firm and commanding, gave a slight, uncontrollable tremor. But Nora Bell was a professional, and she was not finished delivering the strike. She pulled out a second sheet of paper, this one bearing the letterhead of a major Wall Street venture capital firm. "We are finalizing our front cover feature for next month's issue, focusing on the unseen forces disrupting national supply chain analytics," Nora continued, her words driving in like nails. "We have been tracking Blue Forge Systems closely. We verified yesterday that your daughter closed her 3rd round of institutional funding over the weekend. The current market valuation of her company is $850 million. $850 million. My father literally staggered backwards, his heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. He looked as though he had been physically struck in the chest. His entire identity, his precious Hughes Ridge supply that he wielded like a weapon at every family dinner, was heavily leveraged and may be worth $20 million on its absolute best day. In a matter of 3 sentences, a stranger standing in his hallway had mathematically proven that the daughter he had dismissed as average for 18 years had built an empire 40 times larger than his entire life's work. The sheer scale of the number made his wealth, his local reputation, and his son's supposed limitless future look shamefully, pathetically microscopic. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The grand patriarch of the Hughes family, the man who always had to have the final word, was struck completely, utterly dumb. His eyes stayed glued to the 9-figure valuation on the paper, his mind desperately trying to reject a reality that was already written in ink. Nora reached into her blazer pocket and produced a thick, embossed business card. She held it out to him. "If you would be so kind as to pass this to Riley," Nora said, her polite tone serving as the final, absolute humiliation. "We need to finalize her wardrobe and schedule for the cover photography by Friday afternoon. Thank you for your time. Mr. Hughes." My father took the card mechanically, his fingers stiff. He did not say goodbye. He did not defend Grant. He simply pushed the heavy oak door shut, the latch clicking into place with a resounding, final thud. He stood alone in the quiet foyer for a very long time. He stared at the business card in his left hand and the articles of incorporation in his right. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe in the sudden, crushing weight of the truth. up on the landing, hidden in the dim morning light. I gripped the strap of my bag and smiled. For the first time in his life, Dean Hughes realized that the house he was standing in was no longer his exclusive stage. And the show was just getting started. I am 36 years old today. Exactly 18 years have passed since the afternoon my father formally defined my existence within our family. I was 18, freshly graduated from high school, sitting in his leather-upholstered home office. I had just handed him a brochure for a rigorous out-of-state university, explaining my desire to study complex systems and operations. He barely glanced at the glossy paper. Instead, he folded his hands on his mahogany desk, offered me a patronizing, pitying smile, and delivered the sentence that would become the soundtrack of my life. "You are just average, Riley," he told me, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "There is absolutely no shame in being ordinary, but let us be realistic about your capabilities." From that singular moment, a hard, invisible line was drawn through the center of our household. I had dared to reject the neat, unassuming roadmap he had charted for me. In my father's grand design, a daughter was meant to be a decorative accessory to the family legacy. I was supposed to marry a respectable local boy from the country club, accept a safe, quiet administrative job at a regional bank, and buy a house no more than a 20-minute drive away so I could produce grandchildren for his holiday greeting cards. When I refused that heavily manicured cage, I was immediately demoted. I ceased to be his child and became a secondary, defective asset. I was the permanent backup plan. The contrast between my existence and my older brother's was blinding. Grant Hughes was the Golden Prince, the flawlessly constructed monument to our father's ego. While I was dismissed, Grant was relentlessly groomed. My father engineered Grant to be the ultimate frontman. Grant was taught the exact firmness required for a power handshake. He was instructed on how to order an aged Scotch with an air of seasoned authority. He was gifted tailored Italian suits before he even finished his sophomore year of college. Conditioned to believe that looking like a CEO was exactly the same thing as being one, Grant knew how to smile brightly at the right investors, how to charm the country club board members, and how to seamlessly insert himself into the center of every photograph. While Grant was being molded into a charismatic shell, I went to a state university and began quietly tearing apart the mechanics of the world. But no matter what I achieved, it was systematically ground into dust at the family dinner table. When I earned a full academic scholarship, saving my father tens of thousands of dollars, he simply shrugged. When I brought home a first-place plaque for a statewide data modeling competition, he did not even take it out of my hands. "She is good at paperwork," my father would announce to his golfing buddies if my name ever accidentally came up. "Riley is a worker bee. She is not a rainmaker. Data does not close deals. It does not generate revenue. You need vision to make money, and Riley just likes staring at spreadsheets." He funneled every available resource, his time, his money, his fiercely guarded network of political and business contacts directly into Grant. My father operated on a deeply entrenched, archaic belief system. To him, an empire was a heavy, masculine artifact, something forged in loud boardrooms and passed exclusively from father to son. The very concept that a quiet, observant daughter could independently construct an enterprise was fundamentally impossible to his worldview. He happily absorbed hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses funding Grant's foolish, superficial early business ventures, writing them off as necessary tuition in the school of hard knocks. Yet, when I once asked for a tiny fraction of that amount to attend a premier analytics seminar, I was flatly denied and told to stop wasting my time on academic fantasies. Through all of this psychological erosion, my mother, Elaine Hughes, remained a passive ghost. She was never directly cruel. She never actively hurled insults at me. Instead, she chose the absolute worst kind of betrayal: polite, perfectly manicured silence. During family dinners, as my father openly mocked my career choices and inflated Grant's mediocre accomplishments into legendary triumphs, my mother would simply sip her Chardonnay, stare at the floral centerpiece, and pretend the cruelty was not happening. "Your father just wants what is best," she would whisper to me later in the kitchen, carefully avoiding eye contact. Her refusal to intervene was infinitely more damaging than my father's arrogance. By choosing to keep the peace, my mother legally stamped my father's abuse. Her silence whispered that the gross injustice in our home was not only normal but acceptable. She taught me that in the Hughes household, a woman's primary duty was to absorb the collateral damage of male ego without making a sound. So, I learned not to make a sound. I stopped arguing. I stopped bringing my college transcripts home. I stopped trying to prove my intelligence to a man who was utterly committed to misunderstanding me. The dining room table transformed from a place of family gathering into a psychological laboratory. I sat quietly, cutting my roasted meat, and I observed. I watched how easily my father twisted financial realities to make a failing quarter look like a strategic victory. I memorized the exact cadence of Grant's voice when he was lying to cover up a mistake. I noted every time Grant was miraculously bailed out of a catastrophic error, from a wrecked luxury car to a botched supply contract, all quietly swept under the rug so the Golden Boy's resume remained pristine. I realized very early on that in my family, the fundamental value of a human being was measured entirely by the sheer volume of their arrogance. They screamed their worth into the room, demanding applause. At first, being called average was a deep, bleeding laceration. It was a word that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what fundamental piece of my soul was missing that made me so thoroughly unlovable to my own blood. But as the years stretched on, the pain calcified. The wound closed over, turning into cold, hard armor. The insult mutated into a highly combustible fuel. I realized I no longer needed their validation. In fact, their validation would have been a catastrophic liability. If they saw my true capability, they would have interfered. They would have tried to steer me, control me, or worse, claim ownership of my intellect. I needed them to be blind. I needed them to continue evaluating me as a harmless, mediocre, back-office drone. The word average became my ultimate camouflage. It was a cloak of invisibility that allowed me to move in the shadows, completely unmonitored. While Grant was busy standing under the blinding spotlight, aggressively defending a hollow throne, I was down in the dark dirt, quietly pouring the concrete for an empire they could not even begin to comprehend. I did not want a seat at their loud, boastful table anymore. I just needed them to keep believing I was a failure for a little while longer. My days were split into two completely different realities. While my peers were attending fraternity mixers or interning at air-conditioned marketing firms, I was living on 4 hours of sleep. By day, I sat in the sprawling, overcrowded lecture halls of a state university, meticulously absorbing every lecture on operations analysis and statistical modeling. By night, I drove an ancient sedan to a dusty, floodlit construction materials transit yard on the industrial outskirts of Nashville. My shift started at 6 in the evening and did not end until 2 in the morning. I was the night dispatcher. The transit yard was a chaotic, unforgiving ecosystem. It smelled of diesel exhaust, damp pine, and cheap black coffee left burning on a hot plate. My office was a drafty trailer vibrating every time a fully loaded 18-wheeler rumbled over the gravel scales. I sat behind a scratched laminate desk, staring at 3 glowing monitors, trying to make sense of the absolute mess that was regional supply logistics. Down in that dirt and noise, I received a brutal, unfiltered education on how the American blue-collar economy actually worked. It was nothing like the sanitized case studies my professors handed out, and it was certainly nothing like the country club fantasies my father spun. I watched honest, hard-working people lose their livelihoods on a weekly basis. I saw small, family-run contractors bleed to death, not because they lacked talent or work ethic, but because the system was rigged against the little guy. I saw a third-generation framing crew go bankrupt because the price of treated lumber spiked by 40% in a single afternoon, wiping out their entire profit margin for the season. I watched a brickmason beg for a delivery to be expedited because a delayed shipment meant his crew stood idle, burning through wages he could not afford to pay. I saw invoices get duplicated by sloppy corporate vendors, freezing a small builder's line of credit for 3 weeks while the bank slowly investigated. Cash flow was the oxygen of the yard, and every single night, I watched someone suffocate. The tragedy was that it was all entirely predictable. Sitting at my dispatch desk, surrounded by thousands of scattered shipping manifests and supplier spreadsheets, I began to see the hidden patterns. The data was shouting, but no one was listening. So I started typing. During the dead hours of my shift, usually between midnight and 2 in the morning, I opened a blank text editor on my heavily battered secondhand laptop. I began to write a rudimentary software program. I was not trying to build a beautiful, user-friendly mobile application for venture capitalists. I was trying to build a survival tool. I coded algorithms that scraped historical pricing data to forecast sudden material spikes. I wrote scripts that cross-referenced vendor identification numbers to instantly flag duplicate invoices or shady suppliers. Most importantly, I built a predictive cash flow model. If a contractor input their upcoming payroll dates and their pending material costs, my system would analyze the delivery delays and warn them exactly when they were going to run out of money, giving them a 3-week head start to secure a bridge loan or renegotiate terms. It was clunky, it was visually ugly, but the math was ruthlessly accurate. After 6 months of coding in the dark, the core engine was functional. I just needed to move it from my local hard drive to a secure cloud server and legally register the entity to protect the intellectual property. I priced it out. I needed exactly $850. In a moment of naive optimism, a lingering childish hope that perhaps my father would finally see the mechanic's mind he had always ignored. I went to his home office. I stood before his mahogany desk and presented a neatly printed 10-page executive summary. I explained the market gap. I explained the predictive modeling. I asked for a microloan of $850, promising to pay it back with 5% interest within 1 year. My father did not even read the first page. He pushed the binder back across the desk with the back of his hand. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and deep exhaustion. He told me that messing around with spreadsheets was a cute hobby, but I should not confuse a computer habit with a real career. He said business was about relationships, about shaking hands on a golf course, not hiding behind a screen writing code. He firmly denied the loan, advising me to focus on finding a stable administrative job instead of chasing pipe dreams. The rejection was sharp, but the true insult arrived 3 days later. That very same week, my father casually wrote a check for $15,000. It was the initiation fee for an ultra-exclusive, private young executives club downtown. He handed the check to Grant with a proud clap on the shoulder, declaring loudly in the kitchen that investing in Grant's networking opportunities had a much clearer, guaranteed future. Grant took the money, bought 2 new tailored suits, and spent his evenings drinking expensive bourbon, entirely oblivious to the fact that his father was subsidizing a mirage. I did not cry. I did not complain. I simply went back to the transit yard. I started picking up double shifts. I worked weekends. I lived on instant ramen noodles and free break room coffee. I hoarded every single minimum wage dollar, hiding the cash in a shoebox beneath my bed. It took me 2 exhausting months, but I finally saved enough. When it came time to file the state incorporation papers, I faced a logistical hurdle. A registered business required a physical mailing address. Renting a commercial post office box or a virtual office space cost $100 a month. Money I desperately needed for server space. So, I used the only free, legally valid option available to me. I registered Blue Forge Systems using the address of my family's house in Brentwood. It was a minor administrative detail at the time, a desperate measure by a broke college student. I had no idea it would eventually become the ultimate weapon against the man who owned that very house. With the servers online, I needed beta testers. I did not pitch to massive development firms. I went straight to the desperate people I saw every night at the yard. My first client was a grizzled roofing subcontractor who was constantly battling supply shortages. My second was an independent warehouse owner whose inventory tracking was done entirely on legal pads. My third was a tough, exhausted female construction foreman who was personally financing her crew's Friday paychecks on her own credit cards because the prime contractor kept delaying payments. I gave them the software for free in exchange for their raw data and brutal feedback. The results were instantaneous. Within the first month, the system alerted the roofer to a pending regional shortage of asphalt shingles, allowing him to lock in a bulk order at a lower price just 4 days before the market skyrocketed. The warehouse owner used my flagging system to discover that a trusted supplier had been quietly double billing him for freight charges for 6 months. But the defining moment came from the female foreman. On a rainy Tuesday evening, she called my cell phone. Her voice was shaking. She explained that my cash flow predictor had flashed red, warning her of a catastrophic liquidity gap 21 days out. Because of that early warning, she had enough time to legally force a partial payment from the prime contractor under a state lien law. She told me that if she had not seen that red warning light, she would have missed payroll. Her crew would have walked off the site, she would have defaulted on the contract, and she would have lost her house to the bank. My clunky, ugly lines of code had literally saved her life's work. Sitting in the drafty dispatcher trailer, listening to her cry tears of relief over the phone, the sheer magnitude of what I had built finally hit me. I looked at the glowing green text on my battered monitor. I had not just programmed a neat analytical tool to make administrative work faster, I had forged a digital shield. I had created the exact armor that thousands upon thousands of vulnerable, hard-working small businesses across the country desperately needed to survive in an industry designed to crush them. The realization sent a cold, electric thrill down my spine. I was entirely broke, chronically sleep-deprived, and completely ignored by my own blood. But as the midnight freight trucks rumbled outside my window, I knew with absolute certainty that I was holding the keys to an empire. I relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina, seeking a sharp geographic break from the suffocating atmosphere of my home state. I needed completely neutral territory to build my infrastructure without the constant, looming shadow of my family's local influence. I signed a commercial lease on a cramped, uninsulated space situated directly above a noisy, independent auto repair shop. The rent was incredibly cheap, and the environment was deliberately harsh. The constant mechanical whine of pneumatic impact wrenches and the heavy metallic scent of motor oil bleeding through the floorboards served as a daily, grounding reminder of the gritty, blue-collar reality my software was built to protect. I practically lived in that office, working relentlessly, nearly 7 days a week. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, often reduced to a few hours on a thin air mattress pushed against the wall. My singular, burning focus was transforming the crude, functional framework I had written in the dark into a sleek, impenetrable enterprise platform capable of handling massive volumes of complex logistical data. The adoption rate across the industrial sector exploded, driven entirely by desperate word of mouth. I did not spend a single dime on glossy marketing campaigns or flashy industry conventions. The platform sold itself purely because it addressed a gaping, bleeding wound in the construction supply chain. A mid-sized commercial builder would implement the system, and within a month, the predictive algorithms would catch a cascading supply chain failure before it even materialized. The software allowed these builders to pivot, source alternative materials early, and secure their profit margins. They kept their contracts intact, they protected their local reputations, and most crucially, they never missed a Friday payroll. When one contractor survived a volatile market swing that bankrupted his direct competitors, he quietly told his peers exactly how he managed to stay alive. My user base compounded rapidly, transforming my servers into a central nervous system for regional construction. Growth was geometric, but the true paradigm shift occurred when the regional financial sector finally took notice. Mid-tier commercial banks and construction surety bond companies started realizing a distinct pattern. The contractors using my platform had drastically lower default rates. Traditional loan officers relied on static, historical tax returns and outdated credit scores, which were essentially just autopsies of past financial health. My system, however, provided a live, predictive pulse of the market. It saw the early tremors of a liquidity crisis months before a missed payment ever hit a bank ledger. Soon, those conservative banking executives and risk underwriters came knocking on the door of the auto shop, climbing the rickety wooden stairs to my office. They wanted enterprise access. They needed my proprietary algorithms to evaluate their own underwriting risks. I began licensing the predictive engine directly to financial institutions, transforming my company from a niche contractor tool into a fundamental piece of regional economic infrastructure. When it was time to scale further and raise institutional capital, I did not walk into venture capital boardrooms with a prepared, emotional narrative. I actively refused to play the socially expected role of the scrappy and underdog female founder overcoming a difficult, patriarchal family dynamic. Empathy does not secure massive term sheets. Undeniable leverage does. I walked into those high-rise, glass-walled offices in San Francisco and New York, armed exclusively with cold, indisputable mathematics. I presented a 0% customer churn rate, an aggressive quarter-over-quarter recurring revenue growth, and a risk assessment model that outpaced established industry standards by a terrifying margin. The senior partners did not fund a compelling story. They funded a highly calibrated, brutally efficient machine that was rapidly monopolizing an unglamorous but massively lucrative sector of the American economy. As the company valuation climbed into the hundreds of millions, I deliberately crafted a dense firewall of mediocrity between my professional reality and my family. During my brief, mandatory appearances at holiday dinners back home, I actively cultivated the illusion that I was merely a mid-level operations manager at a generic software firm. I wore plain, off-the-rack clothing. I spoke in vague, incredibly boring corporate buzzwords about project timelines, software updates, and middle management headaches. My father and Grant swallowed the deception whole. They never pressed for details because, to them, the details of my life were inherently unimportant and unworthy of their attention. They continued to live comfortably in their carefully constructed echo chamber, deeply convinced that the real levers of economic power were operated exclusively by men exactly like them, men who wore expensive tailored suits and shouted at each other across heavy mahogany tables. Grant would spend 20 solid minutes at the Thanksgiving table aggressively boasting about a minor supply contract he had supposedly negotiated, demanding validation from everyone in the room. My father would beam with unrestrained pride, validating Grant's mediocre achievements as strokes of pure genius. I would sit quietly across the table from them, cutting my food and nodding politely, knowing full well that earlier that same afternoon, my data algorithms had processed commercial transaction volumes that easily dwarfed their entire annual company revenue. The turning point in my personal financial strategy came following a highly successful secondary funding round. I executed a quiet secondary market transaction, liquidating a tiny fraction of my personal founder equity. That single, private sale provided me with an immense amount of personal liquid capital. I did not purchase a sprawling mansion or a fleet of luxury sports cars. Instead, I established a private wealth holding company named Grayline Holdings. While my primary company analyzed the market to protect businesses, Grayline Holdings was designed specifically to hunt within it. I assembled a ruthless, highly specialized team of forensic financial analysts and corporate bankruptcy lawyers. Our mandate was simple and highly aggressive. We were to identify distressed corporate debt and acquire heavily mispriced assets within the industrial and supply chain sectors. I used my software's unparalleled market visibility to spot struggling, bloated companies long before the broader financial market realized they were bleeding out. Grayline would swoop in silently, purchase their senior secured debt from panicking creditors at a steep discount, and essentially become the absolute apex predator of the regional supply ecosystem. The wealthier and more structurally powerful I became, the fewer words I spoke, I adopted a permanent policy of absolute strategic silence. I had learned a profound, invaluable lesson watching my brother and my father over the past 2 decades. Arrogance is not just an annoying personality trait. It is a fatal tactical vulnerability. People who are entirely consumed by their own perceived brilliance are fundamentally incapable of looking closely at anyone else. They automatically assume the room is exactly as they demand it to be. My family firmly believed I was invisible, a dull ghost haunting the edges of their grand, self-important legacy. I realized then that the greatest strategic advantage you can ever hold over arrogant men is their absolute, unshakable certainty that you are entirely beneath them. They willingly hand you the shovel, and they never even notice when you start digging their grave. I was seated comfortably in the back of an executive town car, watching the manicured, sprawling lawns of my childhood neighborhood blur past the tinted glass. I had slipped out the back door through the kitchen while my father was still standing paralyzed in the front foyer, staring at a piece of paper that effectively dismantled his entire reality. I knew the exact timeline of his emotional processing. First would come the shock, then the aggressive denial, and finally, the volatile, explosive need to regain control. My phone vibrated against the leather seat exactly 12 minutes after I left the property. The screen flashed my father's name. I let it vibrate. I watched the digital display glow, allowing the incoming call to ring 3 separate times. In the past, a summons from Dean Hughes demanded an immediate, breathless response. Hesitation was considered an act of deep disrespect. Today, I let him wait in the digital void until I was entirely ready. I pressed the green icon and lifted the device to my ear. Riley, he did not say hello. He did not ask if I was on my way to the airport. And he certainly did not offer a single syllable of congratulations. His voice was a harsh, erratic bark, stripped completely of the smooth, arrogant baritone he usually projected to the world. It was the sound of a man drowning and furious at the water. "What kind of financial scheme have you dragged this family into?" he demanded, his breath hitching slightly. "You used my residential address. You used my private home to register some fraudulent shell corporation. Do you have any idea the kind of legal liability you have just exposed me to?" I remained perfectly silent, looking out the window at the passing highway markers. The psychology of his attack was fascinating. Confronted with undeniable proof of my success, his ego simply refused to process it as a legitimate achievement. Because he fundamentally believed I was incapable of building an empire, the only logical conclusion his brain could manufacture was that I was running a massive, illegal con. $850 million does not just magically appear for an operations clerk, he shouted, his volume rising as he paced a room I could no longer see. You are pulling some kind of market manipulation, and when the federal regulators come crashing down, they are going to see my home address on your corporate filings. I will not let you destroy my reputation with your reckless, amateur mistakes. Before I could offer a single word, I heard the sharp rustle of the phone being aggressively snatched away. The audio shifted. "Listen to me very carefully, Riley," a new voice commanded. It was Grant. My brother had clearly abandoned his morning preparations to join the crisis. He immediately deployed the heavy, menacing tone he used when bullying uncooperative warehouse vendors. It was a practiced, artificial aggression, completely devoid of real authority but dripping with entitlement. "Dad is being too nice about this," Grant sneered, his voice vibrating with a toxic cocktail of panic and extreme jealousy. "I do not care what kind of smoke and mirrors you are selling to a magazine. You built this little software gimmick based entirely on the industry knowledge you absorbed from this family. You grew up eating at a table paid for by Hughes Ridge Supply. That means we provided the foundational groundwork for whatever it is you think you own." I rested my elbow on the armrest, keeping my breathing slow and measured. The sheer audacity of his claim was almost poetic. For nearly 2 decades, they had explicitly excluded me from every single aspect of their business, barring me from the room when real conversations happened. Now, standing in the shadow of my valuation, they were desperately trying to retroactively claim me as their own intellectual property. "We are going to have our legal counsel review your entire corporate structure," Grant threatened, dropping his pitch to sound more intimidating. "In the meantime, you are going to call that reporter back, right now. You are going to pull the article. You are going to force Fortune to completely remove your name and our family name from their publication before the weekend. If you do not shut this circus down by Friday afternoon, I promise you, I will make things very ugly. I will tie you and your little startup up in so much litigation that you will never see a boardroom again." He finished his ultimatum and breathed heavily into the receiver, waiting for the inevitable capitulation. He was waiting for the apology, the stuttering defense, the desperate attempt to explain myself. He was waiting for the compliant, silent girl who used to stare at her dinner plate while they verbally tore her apart. I let the silence stretch. I let it hang over the cellular connection for 5 full seconds, allowing the weight of my unresponsiveness to slowly unnerve them. "Riley, did you hear me?" Grant snapped, a crack of genuine uncertainty finally fracturing his tough facade. When I finally spoke, my voice was a flat, temperatureless line. I did not raise my pitch. I did not speak quickly. I delivered my words with the clinical precision of a scalpel cutting through dead tissue. "If Hughes Ridge Supply is operating as flawlessly as you continually boast to the country club, Grant, I have a very simple operational question for you," I said calmly. "Why did my proprietary risk assessment algorithms flag 3 severe credit warnings against your primary corporate operating accounts last night? And why, exactly, is Crestfall Commercial demanding a mandatory, full covenant review of your massive debt restructuring at 9 o'clock this coming Monday morning?" The reaction on the other end of the line was not a gasp. It was not a denial. It was absolute, suffocating dead air. It was a profound, echoing vacuum of sound. I could hear the faint, high-pitched electronic hiss of the cellular connection. I could imagine the exact expression on both of their faces, the blood completely draining from Grant's cheeks, my father's eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. They had spent the last 2 years aggressively hiding their catastrophic financial failures from the world, projecting an image of untouchable wealth. They thought their secrets were buried deep within the secure vaults of private commercial lenders. They had absolutely no idea that the daughter they had banished to the background was the very architect of the digital infrastructure that those lenders used to monitor their survival. I had not just touched a nerve. I had reached directly into their chest and firmly gripped their most shameful, closely guarded secret. The silence dragged on. 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The Grand Patriarch and the Golden Heir were entirely paralyzed, utterly stripped of their vocabulary. They possessed no script for a reality where the backup plan held the power of life and death over their legacy. "The Fortune magazine piece has already locked its final print run," I stated, slicing through their panic with cold, administrative finality. "My schedule for the upcoming weekend is firmly set. I will not be discussing this matter, or any other matter, with either of you over the telephone." "Riley, wait, how do you—" my father suddenly stammered, his voice cracking, sounding incredibly old and devastatingly small. I moved my thumb over the screen. I did not let him finish the sentence. I did not grant him the dignity of a closure. I simply pressed the red button and severed the connection. I lowered the phone to my lap and looked back out the window at the passing trees. The cabin of the town car was perfectly quiet. A strange, entirely new sensation washed over my chest. It was the feeling of a heavy, rusted chain finally snapping. I left Dean and Grant Hughes trapped inside their grand house, staring at a dead phone screen, drowning in the absolute, terrifying realization that they could no longer force me to listen. The historic Georgian Hotel in the heart of downtown Atlanta was a fortress of old money and new power. Tonight, it hosted the Fortune magazine annual Innovator Gala. The grand ballroom on the ground floor was a concentrated map of the American financial elite. Venture capitalists, media moguls, and titans of industry gathered under the massive crystal chandeliers, exchanging whispers that could shift regional economies by Monday morning. I bypassed the crowded grand foyer entirely. I arrived through the secure subterranean garage precisely at 4 p.m. My team was lean, lethal, and ruthlessly efficient. I brought only 3 people with me: my chief financial officer, my lead legal counsel, and my head of corporate security. Every single minute of our weekend was aggressively scheduled and strictly monitored. Upstairs, the penthouse suite had already been converted into a sterile command center. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. I had chosen a deep, monochromatic navy blue. The lines were sharp, minimalist, and completely devoid of flashy designer logos or heavy jewelry. When your company valuation is approaching $1 billion, you no longer need to wear your wealth to prove you belong in the room. The absolute certainty of your numbers forces the entire room to turn and look at you. 200 miles north, hurtling down the southbound lanes of Interstate 75, a rented black luxury sport utility vehicle was burning fuel to reach the city limits. My father was behind the wheel. He had paid an exorbitant daily premium to lease the vehicle, desperate to maintain the visual illusion of a thriving patriarch. Sitting in the passenger seat, Grant clutched 2 laminated gala invitations. He had not earned them. He had ruthlessly bullied a mid-tier drywall supplier who was desperate to keep a contract with Hughes Ridge Supply, forcing the man to surrender his corporate +1 tickets. Within the leather interior of the rented vehicle, the 2 men frantically constructed a shared delusion to protect their fragile egos. My father gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, insisting loudly that my entire operation was a house of cards. He convinced himself that I had somehow manipulated a gullible journalist, and that the moment he arrived, the adults would step in and end my ridiculous charade. Grant aggressively agreed, rehearsing exactly how he was going to corner me near the coat check, grab my arm, and march me out the side door before the national press could legitimize my existence. They were driving straight into the epicenter of American corporate power, entirely convinced they could still treat me like the obedient teenager they used to silence at the dinner table. Back in the quiet, climate-controlled isolation of the penthouse suite, my team was completely ignoring the party preparations. We were executing a hostile financial maneuver. Grayline Holdings was in the final hour of acquiring a massive, highly toxic portfolio of distressed commercial loans from Crestfall Commercial. The bank wanted to aggressively purge their bad debt before the end of the fiscal quarter, and I was buying the entire package at pennies on the dollar. My lead legal counsel, Marcus, sat at the heavy mahogany dining table, his eyes locked on his encrypted laptop screen. He was running the final forensic sweep of the asset ledger before we authorized the massive wire transfer. The quiet hum of the suite was suddenly broken by the sharp tapping of his keyboard. He stopped. He scrolled back up. "Riley," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of its usual calm. "You need to look at this tranche." I walked over and stood behind his chair. He highlighted a specific block of commercial debt buried deep within the Crestfall portfolio. The primary debtor was listed as Hughes Ridge Supply. My father and brother had hidden their catastrophic financial failures from the local country club, but they could not hide it from the institutional ledgers. As Marcus opened the attached digital files, the sheer scale of their desperation bled across the screen. But it was not just a simple matter of unpaid loans or poor market conditions. It was a meticulously documented trail of outright fraud. My eyes scanned the digital documents. There were dozens of massive, emergency freight invoices from logistics companies that I knew for a fact did not legally exist. There were exorbitant warehousing surcharges billed to empty lots. There were continuous, massive cash transfers to unknown third-party vendors for materials that were never physically delivered. "This is a manufactured debt structure," Marcus murmured, his eyes wide as he traced the money flow. "Someone inside the company created a network of phantom shell vendors. They are intentionally bleeding their own operating capital, funneling the cash out through fake invoices, and then using the company's real assets as collateral to take out higher interest loans from Crestfall to cover the artificial losses. It is incredibly clumsy. If a federal auditor looked at this for 5 minutes, the executives would be facing severe criminal liability." I stared at the screen, watching the exact anatomy of Grant's arrogance unfold in raw data. He had likely burned through the company reserves trying to fund some massive, flashy expansion project to prove his worth, failed spectacularly, and then built a web of fake invoices to cover the crater he had left behind. And my father, either through blinding ignorance or willful complicity, had co-signed the collateral agreements. They were not just broke, they were legally indefensible. "What do you want me to do with this?" Marcus asked, his finger hovering over the mouse. "Do we flag it and kick it back to Crestfall?" I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 6:30 in the evening. The gala doors were opening downstairs. My father and brother were likely handing the keys of their rented vehicle to the hotel valet right at this very moment, straightening their ties, preparing to walk into the ballroom to put me in my place. "No," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I want you to authorize the acquisition. Greyline Holdings is buying the entire portfolio, including every single ounce of the Hughes Ridge supply debt. Then, I want you to connect to the suite's wireless printer. Print every single page of that specific file, the fake invoices, the phantom vendors, the signed collateral agreements. All of it." Marcus nodded, his face turning entirely serious. He understood the gravity of the shift. The machine began to hum, spitting out page after page of undeniable catastrophic evidence. I did not call the authorities. I did not text my brother. I instructed Marcus to place the thick stack of warm papers inside a heavy, unmarked black leather folder and hand it to my head of security. The trap was now fully constructed, armed, and completely invisible. I wanted Dean and Grant Hughes to walk into that glittering room fueled by their absolute, unshakable arrogance. I wanted them to smile, shake hands, and believe they were the ultimate predators. I wanted them to feel the intoxicating high of their false superiority one final time before the floor completely vanished beneath their feet. I checked my reflection in the glass one last time, smoothed the lapel of my navy jacket, and walked toward the heavy wooden suite doors. It was time to go downstairs. The grand ballroom of the historic Georgian Hotel was a masterclass in gilded intimidation. Heavy velvet drapery framed towering windows, and massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the most concentrated gathering of wealth and influence in the American South. Waiters in pristine white coats glided seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. The air hummed with the quiet, potent friction of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and media executives exchanging favors. Somewhere near the rear of this magnificent space, my father and brother were wandering through the shadows like lost tourists. I knew their exact movements because my security detail was quietly monitoring them through their earpieces, relaying the information to me as I stood perfectly still behind the heavy velvet curtains of the main stage. Dean and Grant Hughes had successfully bypassed the registration desk using their extorted vendor passes, but upon entering the sprawling venue, their deeply ingrained prejudice completely blinded them. Faced with a room full of titans, they simply could not fathom that I belonged at the center of it. Therefore, they did not look for me at the reserved VIP tables near the podium. They did not scan the clusters of elite venture capitalists. Instead, they scoured the secondary, invisible spaces of the hotel. They checked the coat check queues. They peered down the service corridors leading to the catering kitchens. They aggressively questioned the young, stressed event coordinators working the logistics tables near the rear exit. They were frantically searching for a frightened administrative assistant who had somehow stumbled into the wrong building. They were desperately trying to find the average girl they had created in their minds, completely unaware that she had ceased to exist a very long time ago. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the ambient lighting in the ballroom gracefully dimmed. The low murmur of 1,000 conversations instantly dissolved into a breathless, expectant silence. A single brilliant spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the center of the main stage. The editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine, a man whose editorial endorsements could instantly double a corporate valuation, stepped up to the acrylic podium. He adjusted the microphone, his seasoned voice echoing smoothly across the cavernous room. "Good evening," he began, looking out over the sea of powerful faces. "We spend a great deal of time in this publication profiling the loud disruptors. We celebrate the aggressive visionaries who launch rockets or build consumer empires. But tonight, we are here to honor a completely different breed of architect. We are here to honor the quiet sentinel. Behind the curtain, I took a slow, deep breath, letting the fabric of my tailored navy suit settle perfectly against my shoulders. The American supply chain is not glamorous, the editor continued, his voice steadily building in intensity. It is built on the sweat and grit of tens of thousands of small, vulnerable enterprises. For decades, these businesses have operated in the dark, constantly threatened by unpredictable market volatility and catastrophic cash flow failures. They were ignored by the massive financial institutions. They were left to fail, until one woman decided to rewrite the entire systemic architecture of how we measure risk. Behind him, the massive, wall-to-wall digital screens suddenly flared to life. They did not show a picture of me. They showed cold, indisputable proof. The screens projected the deep blue logo of Blueforge Systems, accompanied by staggering data visualizations, a graph showing a 0% customer churn rate, a counter displaying billions of dollars in protected regional capital, a map illuminating a sprawling, deeply entrenched network of protected construction and logistics firms spanning the entire eastern seaboard. She did not inherit an empire, the editor declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. She built a fortress from the ground up, in the dark, while the rest of the industry was sleeping. Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of Blueforge Systems, our cover feature for this month, Riley Hughes. The pronunciation of my name hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. It was not a polite, golf clap reception. Before I even took my first step out from behind the velvet curtain, the front 2 rows of the audience began to move. 3 distinct managing partners from top-tier Silicon Valley venture capital firms, men who were notoriously difficult to impress and who routinely destroyed young founders for sport, pushed back their chairs and stood up. They were immediately followed by a cluster of regional banking presidents. The respect was raw, visceral, and entirely unscripted. They were standing for the data on the screen, for the sheer, brutal efficiency of the machine I had built. As I stepped out into the blinding wash of the stage lights, the standing ovation cascaded backward through the room like a tidal wave. From my elevated vantage point, I scanned the vast sea of clapping hands and standing figures until I found them. They were frozen near a heavy marble pillar near the rear exits, exactly where my security detail said they would be. My father looked as though he had been physically struck by lightning. His jaw was slack, his pristine rented suit hanging awkwardly on his suddenly rigid frame. The glass of expensive scotch in his right hand was tilted dangerously to the side, the amber liquid seconds away from spilling onto the carpet. Next to him, Grant was undergoing an agonizing, real-time ego death. Grant's eyes were darting frantically around the room, watching the very men he had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to emulate. He saw the local country club investors he had begged for attention, the regional distributors he had bullied, and the banking executives who usually ignored his phone calls. Every single one of them was standing on their feet, their eyes fixed firmly on the stage, gazing at me with the exact flavor of profound, breathless admiration that Grant had always believed was his birthright. The psychological devastation was absolute. I did not rush to the podium. I walked across the stage with the measured, deliberate rhythm of a person who has absolutely nothing left to prove. I did not need to run toward their validation because I already owned the ground they were standing on. I reached the microphone, placing my hands lightly on the edges of the acrylic stand. I waited for the applause to die down. I let the silence stretch out for a few seconds, a heavy, luxurious pause that commanded the absolute attention of every billionaire in the room. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, projecting clearly through the massive speakers. I did not use my moment of ultimate triumph to play the victim. I did not mention the 18 years of emotional starvation. I did not utter a single word of complaint about my family or the systemic misogyny of my childhood home. Complaining is the language of the powerless, and I was holding all the cards. Instead, I spoke directly to the fundamental flaw of the market. We live in a corporate culture that is deeply addicted to noise, I told the silent room, scanning the faces of the investors. We are taught to aggressively value the loudest voice at the mahogany table. We equate a firm handshake and a tailored suit with innate competence, but the market is entirely agnostic to arrogance. The market does not care how loudly you demand to be respected. I let my eyes drift deliberately toward the back of the room, locking onto the shadows near the marble pillar where two specific men were standing. While the industry was busy rewarding volume, we decided to reward visibility. I continued, my tone lowering, sharpening into a razor-thin edge. Because survival in this economy is not about shouting your worth. It is about understanding the mechanics beneath the floorboards. The truth is quite simple, really. I paused, delivering the final, fatal blow with perfect, chilling clarity. Some people inherit a warehouse. Others learn how the entire system actually operates. The metaphor landed perfectly for the investors. They murmured in collective agreement, nodding at the brilliant summation of disruptive innovation versus stagnant legacy business. But for Dean and Grant Hughes, it was a precision-guided munition exploding directly inside their chests. It was the absolute, undeniable distillation of their failure and my victory, broadcast publicly to the exact audience they worshipped. The applause that erupted this time was deafening. It rolled through the ballroom, a thunderous, sustained roar of approval. I stood bathed in the brilliant white light of the stage, looking out at the empire I had conquered. For the first time in their entire lives, Dean and Grant Hughes were trapped in a room where their loud voices, their arrogant posturing, and their gender meant absolutely nothing. Every single metric of power, wealth, and undeniable respect in that massive, glittering space tilted completely, irrevocably, and entirely toward me. I stepped off the brilliantly lit stage, and the heavy soundproof doors of the backstage corridor sealed shut behind me, instantly severing the thunderous roar of the ballroom. The private executive lounge reserved for keynote speakers was a stark, almost violently quiet space. It was designed in cold slate gray and frosted glass, furnished with sharp, low-profile leather seating. The air conditioning hummed, dropping the temperature in the room to a crisp, clinical chill. It felt less like a celebratory green room and more like a high-stakes interrogation chamber. That was exactly what I needed it to be. I barely had time to accept a glass of sparkling water from my chief financial officer when the heavy oak door leading to the service hallway shuddered violently. There was a muffled, aggressive shout, followed by the sound of bodies shoving against the heavy frame. My security detail, positioned like stone statues outside the lounge, had intercepted an unauthorized breach. "Do you know who I am? I am her father. Get your hands off my tailored jacket right now." The voice was muffled through the thick wood, but the desperate, arrogant cadence was unmistakable. I locked eyes with my head of corporate security, a towering man standing by the interior wall. I gave him a single, slight nod. He pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece, murmuring a quick command. The heavy door swung open. Dean and Grant Hughes stumbled into the pristine lounge, looking completely stripped of the polished veneer they had worn an hour earlier. My father was breathing heavily, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. The knot of his silk tie was slightly skewed, and the lapels of his expensive rented suit were rumpled from his brief scuffle with the guards. Grant looked entirely feral. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the stark room as if looking for an emergency exit that did not exist. The suffocating reality of the power dynamic had finally caught up to them, and the oxygen in the room suddenly felt razor-sharp. My security team stepped inside, sealing the door behind them, effectively trapping the 2 men in the very cage they had rushed to enter. My father rapidly smoothed his jacket, his eyes locking onto me. Faced with the undeniable destruction of his entire worldview, his brain executed a terrifying, desperate pivot. He deployed the ultimate survival tactic of the classic narcissist. He attempted to claim credit for the very resilience he had tried to destroy. "Riley," my father breathed, forcing a wide, entirely synthetic smile onto his face. He took a slow step forward, extending his hands in a gesture of paternal warmth that made my stomach turn. My God, Look at you. Look at what you have built. I did not offer him a seat. I did not speak. I simply stood behind a thick glass table, watching him perform. I know you thought I was cruel all these years, my father continued, his voice taking on a hushed, conspiratorial tone. He was actively rewriting a decade and a half of emotional abuse right in front of my eyes. I know you hated hearing me call you average, but you have to understand the psychology of it, sweetheart. I saw the fire in you when you were just a teenager. I knew that if I made it easy for you, if I coddled you the way other fathers do their little girls, you would have grown soft. You would have settled. I had to push you. I had to make you hungry every time I shut you down. It was a special kind of motivation. I was hardening your steel. And looking at you tonight, standing on that stage commanding billions of dollars, it proves that my strategy worked perfectly. It was a masterclass in delusion. He genuinely wanted to believe that his relentless, crushing neglect was actually a brilliant, long-term strategic investment. He wanted a return on the trauma he had inflicted. Cut the sentimental garbage, Dad. Grant suddenly snapped, his voice cracking violently. Grant could not maintain the facade. The sheer terror radiating from his pores shattered my father's attempt at reconciliation. Grant shoved past our father, planting his hands firmly on the edge of the glass table separating us. His knuckles were bone white. We do not have time for a heartwarming family reunion, Grant sneered, his chest heaving. We have a catastrophic situation, and you are going to fix it tonight. The mask was entirely gone. Grant was no longer the golden heir. He was a terrified, drowning man desperately clawing at a life raft. The company is facing a mandatory financial review first thing Monday morning, Grant confessed, his words spilling out in a rapid, chaotic rush. We have a massive cash deficit, a colossal hole in the operating accounts. The auditors from the bank are going to freeze the ledgers, and if they do not see the liquidity, they are going to trigger a default clause on our entire debt structure. He glared at me, completely abandoning any pretense of brotherly affection. He was reverting to the only tool he knew how to use: brute, unearned entitlement. I need you to wire $2.8 million into the primary Hughes Ridge corporate account before dawn tomorrow, Grant demanded, slapping his palm against the glass for emphasis. Consider it an emergency bridge loan. Or, better yet, Grayline Holdings can execute an expedited buyout of our regional distribution centers at a heavily inflated premium. You write the check, we cover the deficit, and everything goes away smooth and quiet, exactly like a private deal between family members. My father immediately sensed the shift in the room. Realizing his loving father routine had failed, he instantly reverted to his natural state of aggressive authority. He stepped up beside Grant, his posture rigid, his face hardening into a furious scowl. Your brother is absolutely right. Riley, my father ordered, his voice echoing sharply against the slate walls. You have a fundamental obligation to this family. You stood on that stage tonight soaking up the applause, but your success still carries the Hughes name. If our company goes down in a public bankruptcy scandal on Monday morning, it drags your precious reputation through the mud right along with us. You are going to protect the family legacy. You have the capital, and you are going to deploy it right now. They were standing in my command center, surrounded by my security personnel, demanding that I surrender millions of dollars to cover up their catastrophic failures, all while using the concept of family loyalty as a weapon against me. It was deeply, profoundly pathetic. I looked at Grant. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating pressure that slowly began to crush his false bravado. When it became brutally clear that I was not going to reach for my checkbook, Grant's desperation mutated into vicious, cornered malice. Do not look at me like you are untouchable, Grant hissed, leaning closer over the glass table, his breath sour with panic. You think you can just walk away and let us drown? If you do not wire that money, I will go straight from this hotel to every single financial journalist in the lobby downstairs. I will tell them exactly how you built your little empire. I will tell them that you sat at our dinner table for years, secretly absorbing our proprietary industry knowledge. I will claim that your entire software algorithm is based on stolen operational trade secrets from Hughes Ridge Supply. I will paint you as a corporate thief who raided her own family's intellectual property to get rich. I will tie you up in so much ugly, public litigation that your precious venture capital board will force you to resign before the end of the fiscal quarter. It was the ultimate desperate threat of a severely outmatched opponent. He was threatening to burn down my reputation if I refused to save his. I did not argue with his completely fabricated legal theory. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain the sheer absurdity of his accusation. Arguing would imply that we were standing on equal footing, when in reality we were in entirely different worlds. Instead, I simply turned my head slightly to the right. I looked at my head of corporate security and gave him a second, almost imperceptible nod. The towering man stepped out of the shadows. He walked calmly to the heavy glass table separating me from my father and my brother. He carried a thick, unmarked black leather folder. He placed it directly in the center of the table with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound echoed sharply in the cold room. My father stared at the black leather. Grant's eyes darted from the folder to my face, a sudden, cold realization washing over his features. The era of empty threats and loud shouting had officially ended. The leather folder sitting between us marked the exact boundary line where their arrogant delusions died, and the cold, terrifying weight of absolute proof began. I reached across the glass table and flipped open the heavy cover of the black leather folder. The sound was flat, yet it immediately sucked whatever remaining oxygen existed in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not match Grant's manic energy or my father's desperate, commanding tone. I let the documents do the screaming. I slid the first neatly clipped stack of papers across the smooth surface, stopping it exactly halfway between us. You are looking at the foundational architecture of 7 distinct limited liability companies, I began, my voice a calm, clinical drone. They were all registered within the last 24 months. All of them list their primary operating addresses as commercial mail drops in Delaware and Nevada. None of them own a single delivery truck. None of them employ a single warehouse worker. Yet, according to your own internal general ledger, Hughes Ridge Supply has paid these exact 7 entities roughly $4 million over the past 6 fiscal quarters. Grant's eyes dropped to the top page, his jaw locked. The feral panic in his expression instantly curdled into sheer, paralyzing horror. Emergency freight expediting, I read aloud from the second sheet, tapping my manicured fingernail against a highlighted column. Catastrophic weather warehousing surcharges, premium material sourcing fees, contracts that exist entirely on paper, executed between your primary operating account and ghost suppliers that you manufactured out of thin air. I paused, allowing the weight of the federal crimes to settle onto their shoulders. I spent a considerable amount of time tracking the destination of that siphoned cash, I continued smoothly. It did not go into offshore accounts or luxury vacations. It was funneled directly into a separate, highly toxic corporate entity. You used it to desperately plug the bleeding holes of your high-end architectural showroom expansion. The showroom initiative was Grant's crowning vanity project. 2 years ago, he decided that supplying drywall and lumber to regional contractors was beneath his visionary status. He wanted to be a modern lifestyle purveyor. He leased massive, overpriced retail footprints in premium downtown districts, outfitting them with imported Italian marble displays and high-end brass fixtures. He burned through the company's liquid reserves at a terrifying velocity, completely failing to understand that the luxury consumer market was an entirely different ecosystem than commercial wholesale. When the showrooms began to collapse under the weight of their own overhead, Grant was too proud to walk into my father's office and admit defeat. The golden boy could not be seen as a failure. Instead, he built a shadow network. He generated fictitious invoices from fake logistics partners, draining the healthy core of the family business to artificially inflate the dying showrooms. He kept the illusion alive just long enough to look like a massive success at the local country club. He systematically hollowed out the foundation of a 40-year-old company simply to save his own ego. "This is insane," my father sputtered, his voice trembling as he stared at the paper. He turned to Grant, his face pale and completely drained of its former arrogant flush. "Grant, what is she talking about? Tell me this is a fabrication. Tell me she manufactured this data right now." Grant did not say a word. He was staring blindly at his own forged signature on a counterfeit bill of lading. "Do not play the ignorant victim, Dad," I commanded, my tone dropping to a freezing register. I slid the third and final stack of documents across the glass. "You do not get to walk away from this table with clean hands." My father looked down. Staring back at him, printed in high resolution, were 3 separate commercial debt rollover agreements and a heavily leveraged secondary mortgage on the main distribution facility. When the operating cash completely evaporated, "You did not ask the hard questions," I stated, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. "You did not audit your own son. You blindly trusted his empty assurances because you wanted to believe he was perfect. You signed the personal guarantees. You authorized the aggressive borrowing from Crestfall Commercial to cover the missing capital. Your signature, in blue ink, is sitting right there, legally endorsing a fraudulent cover-up. You mortgaged the very ground your employees stand on just to patch the catastrophic holes your son created." Grant finally found his voice. It was barely a whisper, completely stripped of its former venom. "How did you get these?" Grant rasped, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "You hacked our servers. This is illegally obtained internal information. It is completely inadmissible in any venue." I almost smiled. It was the pitiful defense of a man who still did not understand the altitude at which this game was being played. "I did not steal a single byte of data, Grant," I replied smoothly, leaning forward slightly to ensure my words carried the maximum possible impact. "I bought it, legally, openly. On the institutional market." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. It was time to deliver the final, lethal rotation of the blade. "Grayline Holdings is not just a venture capital firm," I explained, watching their faces carefully. "We are an aggressive, distressed debt purchaser. At 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, exactly 1 hour before the weekend market close, my attorneys executed a massive portfolio acquisition from Crestfall Commercial. We bought the entirety of your toxic debt structure. The loans, the covenants, the collateral agreements." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of an empire turning to ash. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the dynamic of this room," I told them, my voice echoing with pure, unadulterated authority. "You are not standing in front of the daughter you ignored. You are not trying to intimidate the sister you bullied. You are looking directly at your apex creditor. I hold the legal paper on your warehouses. I hold the liens on your delivery fleets. I own the commercial mortgage on the soil beneath your feet." My father's knees physically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the glass table to keep himself from collapsing onto the slate floor. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had measured my worth in condescending sighs for 18 years, was entirely broken. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of his ruin. "Sigh. Let us establish the new rules of engagement," I declared, delivering the final verdict. "There will be $0 transferred for your hush money. There will be absolutely no secret family bailouts. There will be no emotional exchanges based on shared bloodlines. You squandered the right to use the word family a very long time ago. From this exact second forward, our relationship is governed exclusively by data, strict legal contracts, and severe consequences." I stood up, adjusting the single button of my navy suit jacket. I looked down at the 2 men, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no rage, no lingering resentment, just the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a perfectly closed equation. "You have exactly one choice remaining," I said, stepping toward the exit. "On Monday morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, You will walk into the Special Assets Restructuring Boardroom in Nashville. You will bring your legal counsel. You will sit down at the table, and you will adopt an attitude of absolute, unconditional surrender. If you try to negotiate, if you try to bluff, or if you even think about raising your voice, this entire leather folder bypasses the civil courts entirely. I paused at the heavy oak door, looking back over my shoulder one last time. If you fail to comply, these documents will leave this room and travel directly to the regional office of the federal prosecutor. I promised smoothly. Enjoy the rest of the gala. Gentlemen. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, unforgiving clarity of an executioner's blade. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors of the Crestfall Commercial Special Assets Restructuring Boardroom in downtown Nashville swung open. My father and my brother walked into the room wearing their best tailored power suits, but the expensive fabric hung on them like armor that had already been irreparably pierced. Yet, incredibly, as they took their seats across the expansive mahogany table, I could see they still carried a pathetic, lingering sliver of delusion. They looked at me, sitting calmly at the head of the table, and they genuinely believed that at the final hour, the compliant girl who used to sit silently at their dinner table would suddenly reappear. They thought I would soften, write a massive corporate check, and save their crumbling kingdom out of blind, biological loyalty. They were entirely wrong. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer a polite smile. I sat completely still, flanked by my lead legal counsel on my left and the senior risk auditors from Crestfall on my right. Behind me, a massive high-definition monitor glowed brightly, displaying nothing but the stark, minimalist logo of Grayline Holdings. I was not there as a daughter or a sister. I was the absolute apex creditor, the singular entity that held the legal right to dismantle their lives. "Take a seat," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. "We have a very narrow operational window to resolve this massive insolvency, and there is exactly one restructuring plan on the table." I slid a thick, perfectly bound legal prospectus across the polished wood. "Grayline Holdings is executing a full, aggressive acquisition of all operational assets belonging to Hughes Ridge Supply," I stated, locking eyes with my father. "We are immediately absorbing the logistics fleet, the regional distribution centers, and the entire inventory ledger. Most importantly, we are assuming the payroll. Every single warehouse worker, every forklift operator, every administrative clerk, and every truck driver will retain their employment, their current wages, and their healthcare benefits. Furthermore, every legitimate third-party vendor will be made entirely whole by Friday afternoon." I paused, letting the relief wash over the Crestfall bankers before delivering the fatal condition. "However, the executive suite is being completely liquidated," I continued, shifting my gaze to my brother. "Effective immediately. The two of you are permanently removed from any operational control, board participation, or equity holding in this enterprise. You are out." My father's mouth fell open, but before he could formulate a defense, I tapped the legal document in front of them. "The conditions of this bailout are entirely non-negotiable," I warned. "Grant, you will sign a comprehensive, irrevocable letter of resignation. Attached to it is a sworn affidavit explicitly detailing the network of fraudulent shell companies you created to artificially inflate your failed showroom expansion. Dad, you will sign over all voting rights. You will permanently cease using the concept of our bloodline to attempt extortion, and you will allow your heavily leveraged collateral to enter a controlled, orderly restructuring under Grayline management." The reality of the absolute surrender finally penetrated Grant's thick skull. He completely lost his mind. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed both of his hands onto the heavy boardroom table, launching himself out of his leather chair. "You are stealing our company," Grant screamed, his voice cracking violently, completely ignoring the executives sitting just feet away. "You engineered this entire setup just to rob us blind. I built those showrooms. I only moved that capital through those secondary logistics vendors because the retail market dipped. It was a temporary bridge. I was protecting the cash flow, and you are using my strategic management to stage a hostile corporate coup. He was so deeply consumed by his own victimhood and towering arrogance that he completely forgot who else was sitting in the room. He had just handed them the final nail for his own coffin. The senior Crestfall auditor, a stern woman in a crisp gray suit, leaned forward and adjusted her glasses. She looked at Grant with an expression of profound professional disgust. "Mr. Hughes," the auditor said coldly, her voice cutting through his manic shouting, "you have just formally admitted, on the official record, in front of your primary secured creditors and legal counsel, to willfully commingling corporate funds and intentionally falsifying vendor invoices to obscure massive financial losses. You have legally validated the exact breach of covenant documented in this file. The default conditions were already met before you even walked into this building, but your verbal confession just eliminated any chance of a civil appeal." Grant froze. The air completely left his lungs. The door he thought he could lie his way through had just been permanently bolted shut by his own unhinged arrogance. He collapsed back into his chair, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray, realizing that his golden son had just legally destroyed them both. My father made one final, desperate play. He looked at the Crestfall executives, then turned his eyes to me. His face was wide, frantic, and pleading. He reached his hand out across the polished wood, his fingers trembling. "Please," my father whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its booming authority, "we are your family. You cannot just erase us from the legacy I built with my own two hands. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I did not blink. I looked directly at the man who had spent 18 years actively trying to convince the world I was worthless. "I did not come here to save your fragile egos," I replied, my words echoing with absolute, unshakable finality. "I came here to save the people who actually do the work." The meeting concluded less than 20 minutes later. The papers were signed in total, suffocating silence because they had absolutely no other legal alternative but facing a federal fraud prosecution. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, a mass email was dispatched to every single employee of Hughes Ridge Supply. It assured them that despite the gross mismanagement and sudden departure of the former executive team, their livelihoods were entirely secure under the new Gray Line infrastructure. Coincidentally, the digital edition of Fortune magazine published its highly anticipated cover story that very same afternoon. The narrative spread like wildfire across the national financial sector. The story was no longer just about a brilliant female founder who conquered supply chain analytics. It evolved into a terrifying, awe-inspiring legend of a woman who possessed the cold, calculating fairness to buy a collapsing empire, protect the innocent blue-collar workforce, and allow the corrupt, arrogant men at the top to hang themselves with the very system they had tried to manipulate. Late that evening, I sat in the back of my executive town car, parked quietly across the street from the main Brentwood distribution warehouse. Through the tinted glass, I watched a fascinating scene unfold under the harsh yellow security lights. My father stood completely alone on the edge of the cracked asphalt. He was wearing his expensive cashmere coat, his shoulders slumped heavily, looking smaller and vastly older than I had ever seen him. High above him, a contracted work crew operating a heavy hydraulic lift was systematically unbolting the massive, rusted steel letters of Hughes Ridge Supply. They lowered his ruined name to the ground with heavy, echoing metallic thuds. In its exact place, they began hoisting the sleek, brightly illuminated modern signage of Gray Line Holdings. For 18 long years, my father had desperately tried to convince the world, and himself, that I was nothing more than an unremarkable disappointment. He had wielded the word average like a blunt weapon to keep me in my place. But as he stood there shivering in the cold night air, watching his entire legacy being systematically dismantled and replaced by the empire I had built from the shadows, the absolute truth finally settled over him. The word average was no longer a label he could ever paste onto me. It was the final, devastating sentence handed down upon his own narrow, pathetic vision. Thank you so much for listening to this story to the very end. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that this story can be discovered and heard by many more people.